So I want to welcome you to this video cast for the Journal of Missional Practice. I'm with Andrew Menzies and Dean Phelan, and today we're talking about their new book, Kingdom Communities. And as we get into the book, it's very much about Dean and his work and Andrew and his work. So this is not a book up in the sky. It's about what they have been working on and practicing. So we're going to begin by asking you to introduce each other. Who are you? What do you do? Give us a bit of background that gives us a feel for the book.
You go, Dean.
Coward. So I'm introducing Andrew. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Menzies, who is the principal of Stirling Theological College, which is the national college for Churches of Christ in Australia, based in Melbourne. Andrew is also the Deputy Chancellor of the University of Divinity. I've known Andrew as a colleague and a friend for quite some years now. I've lost track how many, but Andrew was very supportive of the work that we were trying to do in Queensland over nearly a decade, when I was in the role of heading up Churches of Christ in Queensland. And we were particularly at that time in a fairly dire situation. And Andrew was absolutely a dialogue partner for me and us in Queensland, and would come up and speak, and was a listening ear and an advisor, if you like, along the way. And at the time, we were seeking to try and change language up there from church and church planting, because it's so loaded. And so we came up with this idea of kingdom access places, which I can talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, we'll do that later, yeah.
Yeah, which morphed into Kingdom Communities, which was the title of the book. So,
so he's a good guy, huh?
Yeah. Look, I found him. As long as you don't talk about Collingwood, yeah, that's all right.
That's good. This is about
the local football team.
Football,
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Andrew, over to you. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Dean, who's a good friend and colleague of many years. Dean's background is in organisational psychology, and long ran a commercial practice consulting across a whole range of areas, including in senior executive management and consulting in the healthcare space with large public-private hospitals, people across human systems, large human systems around the community, around health, around caring, and beyond. Parallel to that, he's had significant governance roles across the church, local, but particularly across the state. This is the way we're structured in the Church of Christ world. State governance roles in all of those spaces that life takes you. In the midst of that, those two things came to a head about just over 10 years ago, where Dean was asked to go as the Chief Executive Officer to the state of Queensland in northeast Australia. Large state, about a quarter of the landmass of Australia, very spread out, probably 3 or 4 million people, and a denominational system that was polarised, was divided, was quite broken, and as one of the books recorded, was in a whisper of insolvency and ceasing to exist. So Dean went into that space and sought to bring it back together and heal it. And in that process, needed to go back to understand new language and new meaning, where the care side, which had 140 different sites of aged care right down to children's care, actually was given validity in a theological sense rather than just doing care. But the church side which had somewhat marginalised itself in its language to just bums on seats on Sundays, had to rediscover itself in a broader, more meaningful context so that it could participate together across the whole system. And Dean very carefully and very wisely stewarded that whole system towards health. In many ways, and we'll discuss some of the tools through the conversation, but particularly I think through giving it new language. I think the new language house that was created in Queensland opened significant possibilities. Dean just hinted at the idea of kingdom access places, which is something we borrow in the book to call kingdom communities. But the idea that an aged care centre or a daycare centre or something else doing something responding to need in the community is just as much a place where people can access the kingdom as a church. And Dean, I think, brought a beautiful sense of equality and justice to the mission of God in all the different nodes in his system.
That's great. So, and this is for many who will be listening to this, as I understand, in Churches of Christ, you have both local churches and you have something larger that connects them, which are this community care ministry.
Yes.
And that in some sense, the community care ministry had grown out of touch with any sense of relationship with church, and the churches themselves had grown fairly insular inside them. And
Yes.
what the book is about is something incredibly wonderful that happened in and with and amongst both of those pieces. So talk a little bit, just very briefly, about what happened that the two of you sat down and said, we got to write about this. What brought you to sort of write this book?
Yeah, well, you should lead that, Andrew, because Andrew extended the invitation to me to join him in the writing of a book that you had on your heart anyway. Yeah, so Andrew.
So I had been away 2016 on sabbatical to write this, what became this book. I'd done a lot of journeying with Dean and his executive team and a number of other folks across Queensland, and I really felt that they were onto something. But the request that had kept coming from Queensland was, we need a theological piece to kind of frame what we're doing intuitively. We need to think deeper into what we're building and how we're bringing this together. And so there was this ongoing dialogical loop that kept happening over years, where I would go up and listen and get knocked into shape and have my probably stale ecclesial frameworks knocked into shape a little more. And then I would also have the privilege of challenging them around what are they doing, and some of the language that was used around kingdom, etc., could be a little cavalier or a little colonizing, or in essence, which is not what they wanted. And so we actually formed a really nice partnership around that. And I'd gone on sabbatical to start to write it down. The starting points for me in my quest were the Newbigin type questions around how do you win the West? The hearts, the minds, the souls, the communities. How do we actually retranslate the gospel so that it's meaningful and that it actually contributes in the life of communities and families and people on the ground, in country towns, in cities and neighbourhoods, who in Australia certainly are just not going to come to church.
Yeah.
That's it. The census, we probably anecdotally know that in many places in the West, and certainly in Australia. So I went back to the New Testament, and the two things that drove me were the parable ideas of harvest that Jesus talks about, because we just see no notion of harvest with our current language, and yet it's there. And either Jesus was playing with us, or he was meaning something that we're not doing when he talks about harvest with the kingdom. And also the word ecclesia and church, and trying to separate the two and try to understand actually what was Paul talking about when he said ecclesia, what was Jesus talking about when the word church only appears a couple of times, 3 times in Matthew. And yet it's the driving vision for so many churches, and I think they'd know really what they're talking about because it's not in the New Testament. So that was the starting point of trying to look more deeply into what ecclesia means, what it's getting at, and what harvest is about, which led me into a number of different case studies that were scattered across the country where they represent some of that. But what I found was an incredible richness in Leonardo Boff's exploration of ecclesiogenesis, who has the same phenomenon without priests in Brazilian villages. And I think younger people in the Protestant West have probably forgotten the whole liberation story that Boff introduced us to, which has very relevant lessons for us today in a post-clerical, post-ecclesial age. And then starting to look at some of the case studies of one system in particular called Urban Neighbours of Hope, that is small groups of people who go and live in very poor neighbourhoods on the poverty line and just join the neighbourhood. They live there, they become friends and neighbours with people in the Dockside slum in Bangkok or South Auckland among Maori and Islander folks with a whole lot of social, drug, alcohol issues. And they do tremendous kingdom community building as small little ecclesial nodes. And yet there is no budget, it doesn't cost anything. And I compare it to the hundreds of thousands and millions spent on building some of the statesman churches of where we're going and that yet have very little community impact. So I wanted to play with those things. That's the kind of frameworks that are going on inside the book.
Well, let's bring that. So you're wrestling with all of these pieces. You're seeing things, and there's something going on in Queensland that brings this stuff together. What is it that's going on in Queensland that you documented in the book? But for people listening to this, just as briefly as possible, tell us what's going on in Queensland that brings this together to say, we got to write this book.
So I'll go first and then throw it to Dean. But coming from that, what was unique about Queensland was what I've just described was happening across a whole denominational system. Prayer and church going through a journey from brokenness towards finding a new language house and a new way of being the people of God. And that was the centre of the inquiry.
How did that happen, Dean?
Yeah, maybe a quick story that would
That's great.
The pieces. Early on in the piece, as we've indicated in the book, Queensland, the Queensland Conference, which at that time was comprised of 70 local churches, as we would understand them, and about 120 odd care services, as Andrew indicated, aged care, childcare, social housing, etc.
This is social ministry.
Social ministry.
Like an old folks home or a youth, it's that kind of thing, yeah.
They were all in silos. So the aged care was a little silo and the childcare was a little silo. They were all doing their thing, sort of thing.
Yep.
Basically all separating away. The churches, more than half of those 70 churches were under 50 members, couldn't afford a minister, were on the downhill slide. And there was a summit called early on when I took up the role of about a dozen of the, church leaders, and it was about how are we going to plant more churches because we're dying. And
right.
And I was supposedly the guru from the south that had been appointed, so everyone was looking at me as to, well, how are we going to do this? And there was some discussion around new demographic growth areas, etc. I had a bit of a few brownie points. I was still in the honeymoon period, so I pressed it and I said, if we're planting new churches, why are we to do what? What is it that we want to do? And there was stunned silence at that question. It was like,
isn't that what you're supposed to do?
Yes, and I say that because it's almost like an unquestioned dictum to we've got to plant churches, and it's a common thing without actually exploring. Well, to do what? Anyway, so cut a long story short, we reframed the question into, well, instead of planting new churches, could we frame the question as how might we have more of the light of Christ shining in this area? It's a different question.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So we started with that. This quick story was, which we talk about in the book, was on the Sunshine Coast, which is an idyllic area on the coast in Queensland. And it tends to be a retiree, a little bit like Florida in the US. A lot of people retire up there. And we had this question, what might it look like to have more of the light of Christ shining on the Sunshine Coast? And so we gathered a group of people to work on that question. And the answer, next thing was, well, what are the areas of darkness? Do we know how, if we want more light, where are the areas of darkness? And so research was done on that, and men's health emerged out of that research, which was very surprising to me, but that's what emerged out. There was definitely a very high suicide rate, a whole shadow side to the retirement and sun and sunshine type thing. There was loneliness, isolation. Yeah.
So they were finally listening to what was going on in their communities.
This group was, that's right. Yeah. So the idea of a men's shed was born as a possible way of how to address this issue of men's health. And so I'll jump over, it's documented in the book, some of the steps, but we came up with this men's shed, and emerging out of that, there's no question of God's hand being on it, or God's spirit moving through this, because one after the other things showed up. And one of them was that a minister that had been burnt out, was out of ministry for a number of years, came back in and volunteered and said, look, I'd really love to work with the guys in the shed. Could I do that? And so he emerged, and he was an absolute champion to build this community. So we had the shed, within the space of 12 or 18 months, had over 200 men. There was prayer groups that had evolved. There is even some baptisms that had evolved over time, because it was geared towards building community and building, helping guys, So there was.
So if I lived around there and I was a happy pagan or an unhappy pagan, what would a shed be?
Yeah, so it would be workbenches with projects and building.
Oh, okay.
And building like a model boat, or you build, either you work with other guys on a project, or and this, one of the things that they did do, because Churches of Christ also had childcare centres, they made little model trains out of the timber, and they made dolls' houses and that. And they donated them to the thing. So the guys would come in as often as they want. You'd come in and out, and guys would talk whilst they're making things.
Right,
Mark,
you created a place where guys could be guys.
Guys can be guys. And then, what emerged was, Bill's doing it pretty tough at the moment. His wife's got cancer and his depression. Why don't we sort of have a bit of a cuppa for Bill? And so, and there were Christian guys in there, well, let's say a prayer. Yeah. We'll say a prayer for Bill, and so stuff built, in a blokey way in Australia.
Oh, I get you.
So I was telling this story. We had over 200 guys attending throughout the week on this within 18 months. And I told this story to our council as an example of a different way of interacting with the community, because I said, look, you show me you can't show me anywhere else in Queensland, let alone Australia, that's gone within 18 months to having over 200 guys attending regularly from a zero base, you know. And as I said, they've got baptisms, they're having, you know, they're celebrating community together, they've got prayer groups, you know, it's a flourishing place. Anyway, I'll finish the story here, because this was impetus for connecting more, you know, with Andrew, and it was one of the conversations. I was telling our council, who was chaired by an elder statesman, a senior minister, a very successful one in our system of the biggest church in our system.
Right.
And he listened to this, and he was chairing it, and he banged the table really loudly, and he said, "It's fine to give people peanut butter sandwiches, but how are you bringing them to the foot of the cross?" And he said it exactly with that tone of voice. And I remember sort of almost rocking back in the chair, and it was like I had this mixture of feeling angry and trying to process what he was saying.
Yeah.
And because I wanted to say, this is my understanding of how people can come together and find something of the kingdom of God, you know. But because of my journey, I'm certainly not a naive in theology, but I don't classify myself. That's not been my journey of a deep theologian. And I remember saying to Andrew, it prompted me, that and several others, to actually, I framed it. I said, look, can we commission you to put a piece together that actually undergirds what we are trying to do? And the honest truth was, I wanted to use it to combat, you know, some of these people who say, well, you know, how are you bringing them to the foot of the cross? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was my sort of, which was a fairly, you know, when I reflect back on it, it was a combative sort of thing to try and justify and undergird what I was trying to do. But it evolved and became a more gentle and appropriate thing of, look, it's not just that it's actually trying to articulate and put together a whole new, well, it's not so new, but for Queensland it was new, to refashion what does it mean. So over the decade we were successful in shifting the language from how do we plant new churches to how can we create more places where people can access the kingdom of God. And then the question became, well, how would people be behaving? What would it look like when you came into that place? What would be going on? What would be the practices that we would say are integral to that? And so all of that fed into when Andrew said, would you co-author the book with me? I wanted to tell the story of all of that and try and get some of that into it. Yeah.
Okay. So let me tell Andrew, there's lots going on there. And it's not just that you change language and something happened. There's just lots going on the ground in which you, Dean, if I hear you right, you are actually opening spaces and creating permission for people to try and experiment things and discovering what God is doing out of that. Andrew, connect that, because BOF does play a big part in your book. Connect that with your own sense coming out of BOF of base Christian communities, and how does that relate to what Dean is up to, and how does it get worked out in the book?
Well, one of the great struggles in the church is this clergy-laity dualism that continues to professionalize Christian work away from just grassroots initiatives. And what I saw happening right across Queensland was grassroots initiatives where, using the case of the men's shed that Dean's talked about, a bunch of local people started surveying and taking serious listening exercises in the community to find out where the need was and how to respond. And the response, dealing with suicide and men's mental health, was outside the skill set of any clergy. it was actually, but the response was within the skill set of people who were surveying and doing the testing. And so the response was this beautiful community of a men's shed. And there were some wonderful initiatives and sharing of resources and land and things to develop the men's shed. But one of the senior ministers there was wise enough to understand what was going on and become a journeyman to the whole process. And he got involved, he regularly was there. And for those who care about church growth, his church boomed as a result.
Yes, yes.
Because all the blokes, you know, if there was a funeral or a wedding or counselling or they wanted something, this guy was right there and scooped them all up. And so there's your secret.
Yeah, at the same time, his church more than doubled in size, which was not the primary objective, but that's what happened, as Andrew said, through simple building relationships and loving the guys.
So back on the Boff thing, one of the really important gifts that Leonardo Boff gives us there is to not just get rid of clergy. What he does is he puts clergy in their place. And he says they have an important sacramental, ecclesial role, but let's give ministry out to all the people to play, to engage, the people who are on the ground, in time, in real relationships, in real contexts. And Queensland was stumbling onto that in beautiful ways. One of the other key things, though, that happened from Dean and one of Dean's key staff was at an executive level, in the judicatory system, they were onto this as well. And so there are a couple of instances, say with this men's shed, or there's another story Dean could tell in far north Queensland where a community resource drop-in cafe centre was open. Dean and a couple of his key people had the audacity when people were reaching out. Often their initial quest was, we've got to plant a church, where do we plant it? Dean and one of his key guys, Jerry, had the audacity to ask, is that what God wants you to do? Is that the only response God wants, you to plant a church? Is there another way? Is God opening something else? And so I think they were intuitively onto some of what Boff was talking about as well. There is an ecclesial religious function for the church, but within their system, there was just a groundswell of people ready to be tapped into if they would simply release them to listen and inquire locally. And then within their own system, what this language also did was it empowered all of the community care areas, 140 different areas, one of the biggest aged care networks in Australia, one of the a whole lot of childcare centres and community responses. The dualism we operate with, it's only about bums on seats, tends to disempower those care areas into just secular welfare responses that once had a church link and now are in mission drift. This Boff-like response of giving ministry back to local people who respond, it re-empowered many of those sites as well.
Yes.
So let me ask it the question. I'm going to ask the question then, because I think, as both of you know, from the 60s on, all kinds of people, some of them living in your country, have written all kinds of books about liberating the laity. And from my perspective, they didn't amount to a hill of beans. Great ideas in the sky. So what, if you both of you could stand back and look, and it's in the book, what have been some of the key elements in which, in actual fact, ordinary people of God, in the places where they were discovering what we would call ministry, were discovering engagement with God and kingdom? What was going on there? Did you read a book and say, these are the steps? Give us a little bit of why this was actually happening on the ground.
Well, from my point of view, I think I was driven by this idea which is which is me, about that. You know, every individual is looking to try and flourish in their own way, and there's a lot of we're all looking for purpose and hope and meaning and what have you. But there's a lot. But from a philosophical point of view, that you know, it is about flourishing. And my theology was that, you know, and I used to often use the Jesus thing, I've come that they might have life and have it in abundance. You know, that's what actually the Christian movement at its best is about. That it's about life. It's about life giving and being uplifted. And so, I guess because of my journey, I was sort of intuitively channeling what I would call my psychological background and being in the church for all of my life. And somehow when I went into the role of head of Queensland, it became really important for me to know where am I standing and what am I trying to forward here. And for me, it wasn't about planting more model churches, because it just wasn't going to work and people didn't want it. So what happened on the ground, I think, was a series of things of trying to shift the overall narrative to that somehow it was very, very prevalent. I think this underlying narrative was, you know, expressed by bringing people to the foot of the cross, that our job as Christian leaders is to somehow get people over the line. We baptize them and bring them in, and they're a saved soul. Then we move on to the next one. It was a deep theological and I think a narrative that was all prevailing. That's what, as Christian leaders, our job is to do. So I think for me it was like, well, no, it's not about that. Now, there's been lots of more books written about discipling and a whole lot of other things, but he had to shift the narrative. So the narrative to me that I worked, and I was able to gather, as Andrew said, a whole group of people, of like-minded people, that what we're on about is creating environments where people can access the kingdom of God, that people can find their way back to God. And so the question keeps coming back to, that could be a childcare centre, that could be an aged care centre, that could be a men's shed, that could be a drop-in cafe, it could be a local church. There's nothing wrong with what we've done, but I kept saying, look, the research over here, that is appealing to about, if we're lucky, about 10% of the market, if you want to use business terms today. That model that we have traditionally used of gathering people on Sunday morning to sing songs and, you know, have fellowship together. It's lovely. I've grown up in it, but at best, it's appealing to about 10% of the population, and the other 90% have voted with their feet. So God came for all people. So it's finding. So I don't know if that's answering the question, but
well, it's sort of answering the question, but let me do it in a different way. Andrew, what did you see him doing? Because he's describing to us how his thought process works and that, but what was he doing?
Well, I think Abraham Lincoln famously quoted Jesus when he said, "A house divided cannot stand against itself." And your initial question around the whole laity thing since the 60s,
yep.
I think by and large, what's happened in this whole conversation has been dualistic responses, where one side's not working, let's jump over to the other. So it's system, anti-system. We saw that in a huge way in Australia over the last 20 years with the Forge network. I think it's growing in North America now, founded by Al Hirsch, who's a friend and a colleague from our system. But if your starting point is, that's broken, that doesn't work, I've got the answer, come over here.
Yeah.
Or same thing with the big and the mega churches. That's broken, I've got the answer, come over here. You've got these different people with their one-stranded answer. It's just dividing a house, and it cannot stand. What happened in Queensland, and what we're trying to paint in the book, is a completely different, unified response that respects each of the parts and what they bring to the piece. And so I think what happened in Queensland and what continues to happen. And it has been under threat in recent years, and they've had to work through as these other forces kick back in.
Yeah.
I think what's happened is the core of the response was one of unity and experimentation and listening and empowering. And the system itself was learning and responding, as opposed to lurching to the latest model or whatever it was. If the latest model is just laity or big churches, or, we know that doesn't work. But if it's about being the people of God and shining the light of Christ through faith, hope, and love, we can do that. And the problem for the existing church is the answers are often very different to what we've set out to search for. That's what happens in the book.
That's certainly true in the book, yeah.
There is growth. The churches do grow. The kingdom access places that we call kingdom communities in 7 years grow from about 210 to 380. So there's exponential growth if that's the goal. But growth wasn't the aim. Kingdom and shining light was the aim. And I think it's getting away from this system, anti-system stuff into a much more simple gospel unified response where we each have a part to play, including clergy, who bring important sacramental parts to the journey. And we're watching the world as Notre Dame burned so tragically last night. We're watching the world grieve over that part of what that symbolises for so many people. It's real. And
absolutely.
You can't just cut off pieces.
No.
We've got to be big in that. So I think some of that is what was going on in the system. Is this was a system seeking to be unified in diversity.
Yeah. So Dean, you're, as Andrew introduced you, you're skilled and you bring lots of experience. In the midst of that, not to deny, but in the midst of that, then there was at work this intuitive sense of, to use Andrew's point, we're not going to become polarized. We're not going to divide. It's not that one group's right or another group's better, but how across congregations, laity, clergy, across social care systems, how together do we learn to be a kingdom people? And that really, it sounds like, created the spaces and the environments for people to experiment in all kinds of ways.
Yes, very much so. I look, like any social change, it takes time to get there, but it was gently trying to say that the language was shifted because like we in many ways we're a big corporate system. So I could, in the role that I could pull some levers. So what we did was I created a newsletter that went out every month, and every month we told stories about kingdom access places. So I kept hammering the language and giving examples of that, and being fairly, I think, calculated or astute, trying to be astute, of using language to the church network to say, hey, look, we're winning here, we're not dying, so people here. And I'd hammer the fact that we had a baptism in one of our social housing complexes. So I really played that up, to say, I told stories like we had a once great church in Charters Towers, which was part of the gold rush over here. And in its heyday, it was a beautiful church. It had diminished over the years. The church was crumbling, and they no longer could afford to keep it uptake it. So it had diminished the Charters Towers Church of Christ to 9 people that met in their home once on Sunday, and they'd share a Sunday lunch meal together. And they had a prayer, and they'd celebrate communion, and it was lovely. And I joined them one day for that. I then went in the same week to one of our big aged care homes down on the coast, and they had a chapel inside. They had over 100 people regularly worshipping, families coming in with residents of the homes that come in. They'd had a minister conduct the service. It was a 4-hymn sandwich in our system, the great old hymns, the lady hammering it out. It was great. And I use that as an example. In our system, Charters Towers was listed on our church directory. We had a directory that appeared on the website, and it had 70 churches, and that was one of them. And then we had different directories for our aged care services and our things like that. And this particular place, Maryborough was listed in the aged care directory as an aged care service. And I said, tell me what criteria are you using to split those things? You know, that, because I said, by our traditional standards, Maryborough Aged Care Centre has they worship in a church. They have a minister who gives a sermon. They have an organ. They sing 4 songs. They celebrate communion in the traditional way. Pretty hard to, and they do it twice a week if that counts. You know, Wednesday and Sundays. You know, yeah. And there's a lot of love, and there's a lot of prayer, and there's a lot of caring and community in that. Charters Towers, once great, 9 people. They meet once a week. There's nothing, they don't do anything else. You know, there's no sermon, there's no songs, there's no offering, all the things that we would say. But we're really happy to say that's a church because it's diminished out of what was once a church. So right. We used lots of stories like that, just to keep putting out there that, look, you know, some of the models we have subliminally in our mind are not helpful. Can we stop saying we've got 70 churches and 32 aged care centres and all of the stuff that, and it was on our website and everything else, changed all of that and said, we have over 200 places where people can access the kingdom of God, where there are Christians who are trying to forward God's message. And I get, not everybody is a Christian in our, because, you know, the traditionalists are saying, oh, well, you know, they're not all Christians there.
Yeah, it's not pure.
Yeah, and I said, well, they're not all Christians in a good growing church either.
No.
On the journey. So we did a lot of that on the ground to shift try to shift the understanding. What does it mean to be the people of God in a community? You know, yeah.
So that gets us to what you've been talking. You talk about Language House, and that one of the most important things you've done is shift the Language House, and you've given some illustrations of that. And Andrew, you may want to comment on this. For people listening to this, that might sound like strange language. Talk a little bit about what you mean by that when you say it, and then we'll shift to lots of denominational execs and leaders listening to this. What would you say to them that's come out of this book in terms of your own learning? But let's get to the Language House piece first.
Okay, look, a language house is simply the words, the phrases, the stories you use to create a social imaginary, to create the way that you understand yourself and your system as well as the world. And we all do it. Football, football clubs do it, churches do it. We all use words and phrases to create an understanding of how we see the world and therefore how we respond to the world. And so I think what happened in Queensland, there certainly was a bit of play around creating certain words and phrases and understandings that had deeper meanings, that was trying to untangle the system. But I think what it was also trying to do was to place people theologically God and the mission of God in the world. So our language house typically places us in circumstances where we think it's us against the world and God lives inside our systems and inside our buildings, which is patently unbiblical, untheological, and God's always breaking out of whatever box we put around God, because the world is the Lord's. But I think some of that was what was going on as well. There's a great story in northern Queensland, outside the back of Cairns and Port Douglas, which is the tropical north tourist area, beautiful area. An hour up the road, up in the highlands, in the tablelands, there's a there's a much more poorer rural community called Atherton, and the minister from down the hill had planted a couple of churches, was looking to plant one up there. and went up there, was not welcomed by the other local ministers because there's a threat. As he talked with the town, the language was, well, why would you want to plant another church here? We've already got 5 and they're half full. Because that's what a language house does. It kind of places you within us against the world. We'll go and create another thing of what we know how to do.
Mm-hmm.
When Jerry, one of Dean's executives, challenged him and said, what if God doesn't want you to plant a church? What if God is up to something different and outside of the church? It rocked his world.
Yeah.
And it played with the existing language house that he had within his modus of operandi as a professional pastor. And the story of that was just a beautiful one. I don't know whether Dean wants to tell it, but it shows what happens when you start understanding God in the world as opposed to God living in the church building on Sunday.
Well, I think that's part of the power of the book, in that you talk about language house and you talk about other things, but you actually tell stories that demonstrate for people how that was taking place. But Dean, go ahead.
Yeah, well, briefly, the question then became, as Andrew said, well, we're not looking to somehow create another, find another building or meet in a school and on Sunday morning to compete with the other ones there. It was more about, well, in simple terms, what was the needs of the community? Where were they hurting? And it was a poor rural area. And it was young mums. There was nowhere where they could meet. There was a lot of isolation and need for people to come together, and they didn't see the local churches as providing any of that. They were, anyway, it wasn't doing it for them. So we came up with this idea in talking with often if you talk to the community leaders, they will give you a clue in terms of, right by that, the local council CEO or the Shire officers or whatever. And so we came up with this idea, well, what if we start a cafe? There was no really nice cafe in the main street. The main street's just this, drag through the centre of town sort of thing. But we came up, and we did it, because it's not heaps of money on the cheap. We did it with packing cases, we had, again, it happened every single time. God shows up if you got a bit of excitement and gather people around. So this guy's a carpenter. Yeah. I could do that, So suddenly people are doing stuff, and so we got the shop fitted out, and then there was a plumber who said, yeah, look, I'll connect the water up for the cafe coffee machine and all that. So we got a rudimentary cafe going in the main street, in this, area. And then it grew, where there were drop-in centres. Mums brought their kids in, and they had a mothers of preschool meeting. Then local artists, they had all of the paintings on the wall of the cafe that just people that they put up.
Yeah.
And it went on and on. There was, I'm not exaggerating, it was like anybody who wants to meet, come and meet here and you find it. And then again, it was beautiful. One of the guys, a member of one of the other churches, just kept coming in. He was a beautiful old retired man, and he just sat there every day and talked to people. I loved him, and that was his ministry that he just evolved. And so, and then there was another character that came in on a wheelchair, and he was a real character. So the community builds, and people suddenly connect. People suddenly get life, and behind it all was an intentionality of this question of what would it look like for this to be a place where people can access the kingdom of God. So from an executive point of view, or the denominational point of view, it was trying to regularly meet with the people there, to encourage them and brainstorm and know that they're supported, But essentially it was theirs. It was a movement thing,
See, you're saying so much in these stories, and the stories are in the book. I mean, part of what goes on in my head is that as a denominational leader, or maybe what I should do is run some seminars for churches on how to assess the needs of the community, and let them go. But that's not what you're doing. I mean, there's something
more basic than that.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. I remember thinking exactly like that, but maybe of that. But it's in fact more basic than that. From a corporate organisational language, it's an action learning group, and I know, Al, I mean, you've done much of that over the years. And
it's in the book.
Yeah. But that's what it is. It's getting a group of 6 to 8 passionate people together to wrestle with the question. And the question we said was, what would it look like if to have more of the light of Christ shining in this place? And they're passionate about that. Then the people themselves and God, I think there is a theological framework to that I'm using it. God shows up, or the Holy Spirit moves amongst those people. And there are so many stories of things that are unexpected that emerge, of people that suddenly put their hand up that have been sitting in a pew and not, and maybe faithfully going to church. There is so much unlocked potential if in particular areas, where if you give people a chance. So it's really like, it's an unlocking sort of thing. And it's really just grassroots. I just kept saying 6 to 8 people who are passionate about meeting. And we at a denominational level will support you. I used to, in the early days, we'll provide sandwiches. We'll provide a meeting space for you if you need it. Often they don't need any of that anyway, but they do need encouragement. They do need to know that they got the backing of the system, if you like, that this is really important. We see this as, and I used to play it up of, this is the vanguard of the Christian movement. This is the future, so.
I think it's important, Dale, you're asking what would we say to denominational leaders. We've mentioned a number of things around language house, around action learning, all good things. There's an assumption that that's in this conversation that we spell out in the book around the difference between hub and spokes and distributed network systems. Yeah. We spell out the hub and spoke system. We explain that command and control, and it's all about aligning the system, the commonality, control, the executive leadership. We try to move away from that. But again, an anti-system response is to a radical distributed networks where just each part is just set off to go on its own. And we watched that in response to your question around the laity. We saw that where lots of those initial third place communities have not lasted. I could point you to 1 or 2 of dozens and hundreds that were started in Australia over the last 20 years. That doesn't work either. We've tried to create a space which is what we call a modified distributed network, where the emphasis is on the local node having empowerment to go about its mission and respond to what the local need is. But there are backroom governance supports. And I think for an executive, denominational executive, that actually is a crucial thing, to give the ownership and the emphasis to local nodes, but to keep the belonging within the wider tribe, where there is resource, there is wisdom, there's a whole lot that can make things sustainable. You can't just have what Dean has talked about in the community with young mums and children without appropriate care, duty of care.
That's very well said, Andrew. Yes,
for the children.
Very well said.
And that's what comes through in the book.
It's a modified distributed network where the emphasis and the empowerment is always towards the local, but it's not a radical laissez-faire story that we tell. There is a operating system going on in the background.
Yeah. I'm really pleased you picked that up, because that is an integral part, because people could think it's just lighting fires everywhere. It has a lot of the elements of that, but the support, because the centre, if you like, we provided, if people needed advice on property, we had property experts that could advise finance, or, as you said, being aware of child protection, requirements, and all of that was available. But it's a partnership model rather than a denominational, we're planning this thing and we're on top of it and watching it. I'm using hierarchical, but it's very much, as you said, a sort of a network partnership collaboration model of mutual respect. Yeah.
So we'll draw this to a conclusion now, but I would say, and you may want to comment, you don't need to, but that one of the powerful things about this book is that it doesn't set up that kind of binary, this is how bad things are, this is what we've done over here.
We hope not.
You work with the both and into play with each other. And as you've said, the center and the distributed. And at the same time, you talk about a different kind of leadership. And you've demonstrated that in this conversation, and it just runs through the book. And that any leader, particularly leading some form of denominational systems who are grappling with these issues, the stories in the book really frame the theology and the theory that you've developed, and very worthwhile. I want to commend it to everybody. And I'm going to do it again. I'm going to say,
thank you,
Kingdom communities, coming out of a country where people just don't buy pie in the sky ideas. It's got to be on the ground. So Andrew and Dean, I want to thank you so much and commend people to your book. God be with you.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, bless you.